Whether you actually get to come to one of our extravaganzas or watch it at home seems to make no difference to the high level of interest in who or what you see on the show. For example, when Eric Knowles' much-loved moustache disappeared, there was uproar. What had he done with it? Did he get a good price? Did it go to a good home? Eric's lips are sealed. But tonight, in the second of our special editions, we provide proper answers to some classic Roadshow questions. Like how this chipped piece of English pottery ended up thousands of miles from home.
It's a major discovery.
Is it really? Gosh.
It's so exciting. I'm shaking holding it here, but I'll put it down carefully.
John Sandon meets the mystery collector who just had to have it. What would you do with a cash windfall? One Roadshow winner reveals all.
I'm afraid they were turned into ready cash. The ready cash was turned into Cheltenham Palace.
We trace the Russian diplomat who first owned this treasure. And Geoffrey Munn drops a bombshell along the way.
You ambushed me. You ambushed me.
Absolutely, I knew you'd be.
I shall have to take very good care of them.
Joining a Roadshow queue is sometimes just the beginning of an epic journey. We've had quite a few teddy bears lining up over the years. Do you remember this one?
30,000 of them were made, and very few remain, particularly in good condition. His pads are remarkably good. They haven't even been moth-eaten, which so often is the case. So somehow your daughter must have put it in a moth-proof bag or something. If you were to buy him, you'd have to pay £20,000.
Is there a wheelchair to take me out of here?
He later fetched the princely sum of £23,000, went off on his travels and now lives happily in a toy museum in Greece. Now let me take you back to our Birmingham Roadshow in the year 2000. It seemed an ordinary day for John Sandon, but he dropped his cucumber sandwich when a small piece of chipped porcelain landed on his table.
Birmingham was a busy antique roadshow, and I've been looking at the usual mixture of things all during the morning. When a lady arrived, I think it was late morning, and she produced a handbag in front of the table and almost sheepishly brought out a little pot from it. It was an exciting moment because I just somehow knew this was something very, very special.
Well, my aunt had it on her mantelpiece all her life. She lived in the same house from the 1920s until she died at the age of 94, about 4 years ago.
Right, so it's just been sitting on the mantelpiece and now come down to you.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. What we've got here is a piece of pottery which is clearly shown by his nose being missing. And I can see inside the colour of the clay, and it chips very easily.
Yes.
We've got a material called Delft. And this material was developed in many different countries. It started perhaps in Italy. It was best known in Holland, where the name Delft applied. And you also get it made in France and in England. And placing where it's made is going to be a very crucial thing to this little object.
As I looked at the piece, it was growing on me that perhaps it was a rare piece of early English pottery, but that seemed almost too good to believe. I mean, the rarity of such a thing would be so enormous. But as I held it, there was some sort of magic quality within the piece that said to me, no, stop, I am special.
Looking at his face there, he's wearing, I guess, a moustache and a little goatee beard, which sort of comes to mind images of Charles I, or indeed Charles II. And that's really the period we're looking at. We've got a piece here in the 17th century.
Right.
But English Delft figures start at substantial amounts of money. They just really don't exist.
Gosh.
So, I mean, cautiously, one is thinking perhaps £50,000.
Really?
It's a major discovery.
Is it really? Gosh.
It's so exciting. I'm shaking holding it here, but I'll put it down carefully because it is a wonderful thing, wonderful condition. What a piece.
To see a totally unrecorded English Delft figure is one of those sort of magic antique roadshow moments.
After the show, the owner decided to sell, and the Turk's head caught the eye of one of the world's most serious private collectors.
As any big collector of anything, you're aware of the marketplace. And I knew about it right away. And I knew it was a special piece, and immediately I said, I'm going to try and buy it.
Having spent nearly a century on a mantelpiece in Birmingham, this little Delft figure became part of the jet set.
The Turk's head was bought by an American collector, an almost legendary collector in the field of English pottery. He has one of the greatest collections of slipware, and particularly early English Delftware, that's ever been formed. I know of the collection by reputation, but I've never seen it.
That is, until now. The fiercely private new owner, whom we can only identify as Sid, an American businessman, offered John Sandon a chance to revisit his star item. For an English potterholic like John, Christmas was about to come early.
Hiya, John.
Good morning, Sid.
How have you been? Nice trip from England?
Yeah, it's been a while. Yes, very good trip. Thanks.
Come on in, let's look at some pots.
Right. I sort of feel like a little child in a toy shop. Just didn't know where to look. You think the potter throwing that on the wheel, making it?
Oh, yes. It's exceptional. Here's a shoe that's dated 1654. Here's one dated 1686 of the little birds. You could see how naive quality in this. And it's the only one in slip, and he's kind of special. That's a drinking vessel, actually. I've always been a folk art lover, and English pottery, Delft and slipware have this wonderful, naive quality to it. The Dutch Delft, which is very popular as well, is very formal, very stilted, where the English, it was just spontaneous.
Sid's collection just goes on and on and on.
If you'll just look inside, John, look at this one. Beware of the sly dog fox, 1731. Slipware is the holy grail of English pottery.
He even has his own Ozzy the Owl. Altogether, there are 600 pieces of English Delft and slipware, and they're everywhere, even in the cellar. One item tucked in the corner looked strangely familiar to John.
I remember these, certainly. A set of Delft fireplace tiles. When I was 12 or 13 years old, I went with my dad out Delft hunting in old houses in Worcester. And some workmen told my dad about an old pub that was being pulled down the next day. And behind each fireplace was an entire 18th century Delft-tiled fireplace in its original state. We took a hammer and chisel, out they came, and the building came down. So we just rescued them, and these are now in the collection here with Sid. It's such a joy to see them again.
It wasn't only the group of tiles that brought back memories. Sid had one final treat for John.
There is the Turk's head that I've come to visit. It's nice holding it again after all these years.
And, you know, it's one of the cornerstones of my collection.
Yes. It looked a little bit happier now. I see he's now got a nose. He's been fixed.
Well, yeah, the nose was a little chipped. But as a collector of Delft, you overlook the little chips and nicks because it's commonplace.
Sympathetic repair can just make him look now as he should do. He's found his real home here.
He's right at home.
In some ways, perhaps, it's sad that this Turk's head no longer sitting on its mantelpiece in Birmingham, but now I think it almost feels more at home amongst the other English Delft figures by joining Sid's collection here in America.
From a quiet home in Birmingham to a place in a multi-million-dollar collection, and it could happen at any time. I was there when that battered piece of Delftware was hauled out of the bag, and I was amazed at how calmly the lady took the news that she might be in line for a £50,000 bonus. Not everyone manages to be so, well, British about it.
What? What? Never.
No, I can't believe you.
You're joking.
You're joking? No. Oh, I don't believe it.
No.
£6,000.
$25,000.
Oh.
I will get some of the mortgage paid off.
You will.
Something in the region of £8,000.
£8,000? Oh, that's a nice thought. Another few cruises.
£12,000.
My friends are over there. Did you hear that? Ring Jean up and tell her.
And the question is, what would you do if you hit the jackpot from a Roadshow sale? Sadly, I can't play that game. I don't qualify. But Margot Norman, who joined us at Harrogate, spent her windfall on her most special friends.
What is all this?
Well, it's a very long story, but I was left a house, and in the attics of the house were all these wonderful papers relating to an old family member who was a naval captain.
Right.
Captain Wood, who was in the Royal Navy, and I understand that his claim to fame was escorting Napoleon and having Byron on board on several trips.
Right. Now, what have we got here?
Well, it looks like Napoleon Bonaparte to me, doesn't it?
Obviously, you knew it was there. But yes, that's clear. Taken at St Helena, October 16. So he'd been part of the crew of the escorting vessels that had gone on to St Helena.
I knew they were something special because the ship's logs had pictures of Napoleon in, and I believe Napoleon was on the ship that this Captain Wood, he escorted Napoleon to Elba, I believe.
Now, this is a genuine ship's log of that period.
Yes, I'm afraid the mice got to it.
But it doesn't matter. You can see here all the entries day by day of what the ship was doing. Now, look here. Memo. Lord Byron came on board of us, frigate Salsette, at somewhere or other, on the 11th of April, 1810, my birthday. He performed his swimming task across the Hellespont on the 3rd of May. So, in effect, he was there while that famous event was taking place.
Absolutely. I'm no historian, as you can tell, but obviously Paul Atterbury just went overboard about it, and he was very excited about them.
When you put the archive together, I think we've got to think of something like, gosh, to give you a sort of broad figure, £5,000–10,000, you know, something like that.
Good gosh. I was amazed, really. I knew they were special, but I didn't know that they were valuable to that extent, you know. If they'd stayed with me, they would have been fingered by everybody, and I thought, well, the best thing I can do is to get these sold.
I had some previous contact. I bought a few things from Mrs. Norman, and she mentioned the papers, and I jumped at the opportunity of going and having a look at them at her house.
He must have been coming and going for about 6 weeks reading all these. And that he said to me, I'm really interested in these, I'll make you an offer.
I believe that it was estimated at about £10,000, and I paid rather more than that, although not double.
I'd already determined what I was going to do with my little nest egg, and I'm sure a lot of people would have skipped off to Benidorm or somewhere for a holiday. If you see anybody interviewed or they win the lottery, usually the first thing they say is, I'm going to have a holiday. Because my holiday is home here every day with my dogs. I decided that I was going to refurbish their kennels. I'm afraid they were turned into ready cash, and the ready cash was turned into Cheltenham Palace.
Gonna build a daydream from a little hope.
Steady now. Come on, kids. Off we go.
Up the mountain slope, gonna build a daydream.
Well, that is nice, isn't it?
Gonna see it through. Build a mountain and a daydream, gonna make them both come true.
There's 6 loose boxes that are in that stable range, and they've all got new floors, new walls, new ceiling linings. The dogs have got nice new compartments. In fact, my friends call this place Cheltenham Palace, because they say the Shelties live in a certain amount of splendour, but it's worth every second. The first dog show I went to was in Camberley, Surrey. It was one of those little shows where you can enter on the day. He got second in his class. I can remember that second prize card was almost transparent by the time I'd finished fingering it and lovingly showing it to everybody. And that started the interest, I think. It is very nice to be asked to judge, and it's a great honour, particularly when you're #1 judge, and it is a huge accolade. But I think if I was given a choice, I'd rather be showing my dog at Crufts. When there's a show coming up at the weekend, I get just as much buzz. I can't sleep the night before. I'm up early and everything's ready. Dogs all preened and bathed and groomed. And off we set. Sometimes with success, not always. There's always another day if we don't do well.
That's a good girl, aren't you?
I'd like to think that if there's reincarnation, that I might come back and be kept as well as this lot are. They have a pretty good time. They get a better deal than I do.
Who could ask for more? Isn't this paradise?
Make the whole world
Imagine that, champagne on your pedigree chum every morning. Now, sporting relics rarely come up on the Antiques Roadshow, but silver specialist Ian Pickford was rocked on his heels by a serious piece of boxing memorabilia. It belonged to 19th century fist fighter Bob Brettle. But what happened to it? I followed the trail of spit and sawdust to the belt's new home, where it's guarded by the heavyweights of today's boxing world. First, a reminder of the object in question.
Because what we're looking here is what appears at a quick glance to be something like a Lonsdale belt. But really, this is much earlier and, in many respects, more important, because we're seeing early boxing history. All the symbolism, of course, that appears in it, the figures on the gilt background. Interesting as well, there's Hercules, very appropriate for a boxer. The symbols of the rose for England. We've got the thistle there for Scotland. And, of course, if you notice along here that he's not wearing any gloves.
Gloves, that's right.
Bare fist fighters. And, of course, poor old Bob Brettle, he died at, what age was it, about 30?
38. He died at the age of 38.
Bob Brettle was a man who was on the fringes of boxing and in the middle of boxing for a good 10 years. He was a man who was ducking and diving, making a living out of fighting. And if he wasn't good enough to beat the very best, then he would make it out of being around them and getting the crumbs that fell off their table, so to speak.
Brettle moved in the shadowy world of bare-knuckle boxing. It operated outside the law. Fights were held in public houses, and there was a great deal of money to be made from betting on who would survive.
The prize ring was the serious end of the business. It was where fighters stood face to face for money and people bet on it. They'd not just bet on the result, you'd bet on how long the fight would last, who'd draw the first blood, who'd lose a tooth.
But it's rather similar to horse racing. A group of wealthy people get together and they would back a particular boxer, and they would bet on that boxer against another boxer who was patronised by a different group of wealthy people and aristocrats.
And in his short life, Brettle built a formidable reputation as one of Birmingham's best-known bare-knuckle fighters of the 1850s. It was a tough game.
For much of the history of the bare-knuckle sport, it was illegal. And a lot of the contests that took place were interrupted by the police. And indeed, the first contest that Bob Brettle had with Jem Mace was in fact interrupted by the police, and that led to the second contest. So there was always a criminality about the sport, and it was a question really how much that was tolerated.
Bob Brettle fought some of the best fist fighters of his time. Men like Jem Mace, regarded as the father of modern boxing, and Tom Sayers, a famous champion of England. To the people of Birmingham, Brettel was a hero, and in 1860 his fans clubbed together to raise the money for a belt in honour of his skills. According to the inscription, the belt was presented as a testimony of his undaunted courage and success in the prize ring.
It's a very distinctive belt, and it would have been put together by a group of wealthy patrons of Bob Brettel who would have put their money together and raised a subscription to get this belt set up. It's a very distinctive design, and it probably records him being accepted as the Midlands champion.
Marvellous piece, very important to boxing history. Actually made, we can see from the marks there, in Birmingham in 1859,
That's
obviously
it.
ready for its presentation. Have you got it insured? No.
Keep it in the bank.
You keep it in the bank. I think that's very wise. If you're going to insure it, it's a tricky thing to insure. There have been very few such objects on the market. I would estimate at auction, one should be expecting somewhere between £15,000 and £20,000. And it should be insured for a little bit more, perhaps £25,000 for insurance.
Get away.
Right.
Tell you the truth, I nearly sold it for £1,000. But I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I didn't.
The owner who brought the belt to the Roadshow was a descendant of Brettel's and, in fact, never sold it. Instead, it was donated to the British Boxing Board of Control in Cardiff, where it's regarded as a priceless piece of sporting history.
It's a very unusual belt, and I have never seen anything like it in the world, in fact. And when you look around our boardroom and you see the other belts that we have, the Bob Brettel belt stands out as being particularly distinctive, a unique piece of boxing history.
There's one word on the Antiques Roadshow that is guaranteed to deliver a knockout.
This throbbing little pink heart with diamonds is made by Carl Fabergé.
It isn't.
It
can't be.
It is.
You're just too good to be true.
It's actually made by Carl Fabergé.
Can't take my eyes off you.
It says K. Fabergé.
Feel like heaven to touch.
I think it's Fabergé.
Wanna hold you so much.
This one says Fabergé.
I don't believe it.
At long last, love has arrived.
Well, if there's an opportunity to say the word Fabergé on the Antiques Roadshow, immediately all the fireworks go off. And sometimes that's paralleled by a very high value, and then the excitement is doubled. And I don't think there would be any chance of you acquiring this jewel under any other circumstances for less than £10,000 today. It might be worth £8,000.
And a weak at the knees, good gracious.
I think probably if this came under the hammer and two people wanted it, I think they might be persuaded to part with £10,000 for that. Had it been in perfect condition, I wouldn't have shrunk from telling you that it was worth £20,000.
20? You're about £5,000.
I'm delighted. I'll give you a big hug.
Well, I'm delighted you're delighted. Just to bring Fabergé fans to a frenzy, I can tell you that in the last few years, archives have been unlocked which allow us to identify the original purchasers of many pieces. Don't ask me how, ask Geoffrey Munn. Geoffrey mounted a stunning exhibition of Fabergé pieces, all fabulous, exquisite, and I think I'd better sit down while this is on. Many of these dazzling items originally belonged to only the wealthiest and most powerful people, which makes them even more valuable. But would we be able to track the dynasty of one of the Roadshow's finds? We're talking Fabergé.
We know far more about it than we did, say, 20 or 30 years ago, because Russia has opened up and we have access to archives and to information which was simply not available to us because it was on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain.
Using newly found archives, we set Geoffrey a challenge. Could he discover who first owned this piece and even take it back to its first home?
I think perhaps the point about Fabergé objects is that they are the grandest gifts that ever were, and they come from a society of unparalleled luxury. People living in pre-revolutionary Russia had their lives decorated in this way in every possible aspect of their lives. The owner of the lilac case has supplied us with its inventory number, and we've discovered it in the ledgers. It was bought in London, and that was the only retail premises for Fabergé outside Russia.
The Fabergé outlet on Bond Street opened in 1903 and was the most exclusive gift shop in the world. It carried an elegant stock of treasures, much loved by, among others, Queen Alexandra, who'd been introduced to Fabergé's work by her sister, the Empress of Russia.
I think perhaps if you're talking about Fabergé, you may be interested in particular workmasters. They presided over different workshops, and one of the most famous was Henrik Wigstrom, who's the maker of this box.
That's who had made it?
Yeah, absolutely. And Fabergé allowed him to sign the box as well, and we see his mark in the lid in conjunction with Fabergé. And Henrik Wigstrom is arguably the most distinguished of the Fabergé workmasters. He was maker of the famous imperial Easter eggs, of which there were 50, and he was called the chief workmaster. So this is very, very exciting too. Well, the ledgers have revealed that the original purchaser of the lilac enamelled case at Fabergé in London was a man called M. Sevastopoulou. Well, this is a highly distinctive name, and it's enabled us to trace a surviving member of his family, and we're going off to meet her.
Lady Ware, very nice to meet you.
Welcome to Scotland.
Thank you.
Well, Lady Ware, I've flown up from London, clutching what I think is a long-lost family treasure. And here you see it.
Oh, my goodness.
It's a cylindrical ladies' cigarette case by Fabergé, decorated in purple enamel over an engraved ground, and it has a little rose diamond clasp. Have you ever seen anything like that?
No, and it's absolutely beautiful.
Well, one of the most exciting things that we've discovered recently are the original archive materials from Fabergé. We have access to the London ledgers and the ledgers in Russia. Now, each and every object by Fabergé is engraved with a stock number with a little steel burin. We cross-reference that to these ledgers, and we have found, very remarkably, that this cigarette case was bought by M. Sevastopoulou on June the 13th, 1912, for £25. Can you tell me how this relates to your family?
Well, my maiden name was Sevastopoulou, and the most likely candidate for this Sevastopoulou would be my ancestor Matvey, who was in the Russian diplomatic service and was in London, between London and Paris actually, and Chamberlain to the last Tsar Nicholas.
And his representative throughout Europe, presumably?
Yes, I would expect so.
Well, the real power of objects like this is that they are souvenirs of a period that is apparently long gone. Historically, it absolutely isn't. This is the age of the telephone, the age of the motor car, and yet somehow or another it evokes an almost feudal past that somehow is difficult to identify with. Slightly haunted experience, really, isn't it?
It is for me, because there are so few connections anymore.
So the Russian Revolution shattered your family?
Yes, but they left with nothing. My father was a soldier in the army and was fighting in the streets at the time, and this kind of thing would have just made his, I don't know, attachment to things that he'd given up.
We're going to take some of this excitement away and transfer it to the owner of the box, who will be as delighted as we are to hear all about it. Thank you very much.
Well, if I can ever learn who the present owner is, I'd be very interested. I'd also like to know how it came into his hands and what the relationship is there.
So could the present owner of the box, Kenneth McKinnon, the man who brought the piece into the Roadshow, explain how it came into his family?
The box came into our family about 45 years ago or so as a gift to my stepmother from a lady who lived in Mull, in fact was a Guthrie, and she had sadly lost her husband, and my parents had been quite supportive, and she very generously presented them with this lovely box. And in the fullness of time, after my stepmother's death, it came to me. And we're going to Torresey because she came from Torresey and in fact owned Torresey Estate.
Will the visitor's book at Torresey Castle provide the answers? Did the Russian diplomat, Mr. Sevastopoulou, ever stay there? In a few moments, the story of the lilac cigarette case comes full circle, and Geoffrey Munn drops a bit of a bombshell. Earlier, we saw John Sandon reunited with some Delft tiles he last remembers seeing as a small boy. John's father, Henry, was also taken back to his youth, although in his case it took a bit longer, at our Knight's Hay show when a farmer carted in some fragments of pottery he'd dug up on his land.
What a lot of broken old pots. How do you come with them?
Well, my neighbours think I've gone to pots, but we find quite a bit of it on the farm. And this has come out of one particular dig that we've been having a forage around.
Yes.
And we've glued some of it back together to try and make some sense of it.
When the Roadshow was coming down this part of the world, we decided we would like to take on a representative selection of what we were finding here. To see if we could advance it a little bit more.
This could be Bovey Tracy in Devon. Is that Devon or Somerset, actually?
No, that's Devon.
That's Devon, isn't it?
They'd be
Yes.
terribly offended if you said it was Somerset.
So Devon pottery again. But that's very, very beautiful.
Yeah. Until Henry Sandon picked that out as being of Bovey Tracy. And then that was the first inkling that we had that it had come from his near home. Is that in actual fact, we thought it might have come from abroad.
Some of it is terribly unusual and important. But what is particularly interesting is that some of this is wasters. That's an unfinished, damaged, distorted. It's all got out of shape. Waster. So presumably there must be a kiln on the site.
Yes.
After we'd been on the Antiques Roadshow, we came home and had time to think about it a little bit more. So then we got in the car and went down to Bovey Tracy, where they have their display of the bits that they found there. And we see the glass cases where they've got it in and say, well, we've got that example, and the other example. Got the curator's phone number off the girl at the desk, rung the curator, who introduced himself as Brian Adams.
I always watch the Antiques Roadshow, and suddenly there was this farmer with some Bovey Tracy pottery in his hands, showing it to Henry Sandon.
Once we'd been on the Antiques Roadshow and made contact with Brian Adams, and he assembled a team to come up and dig the odd weekend, and so we've been doing that ever since.
They've got their expertise as archaeologists, and I know a bit about pottery. I've done some digging, and Robert knows about the history. I think we work well together.
Robert's starring role on the Roadshow brought this dedicated group of volunteers together. But there's one person who's been dying to come along and see what they've unearthed.
Good Lord, look at all this. This is all your work. My golly, this is what you call the museum.
Yes, yes.
Because I've seen some of these pieces before in the Roadshow, but here it is in its entirety. How many hundreds of thousands of pieces there must be? And you've done all this yourself?
With the help of the wife and Brian and a few others that come along and help as well.
Yes, yes.
Well, here we have Henry, the piece sherds that I've glued back together, found at random on the site. And unless we glue them back together, we can't tell whether it's come from a waster or simply broken pot thrown away.
And the pot probably piled on top of it like that. That's absolutely wonderful there. Pots piled on top of each other to save space in the kiln, because fuel was costly, is proof positive that chap was made on your farm itself.
And kiln not very far away from where we found it. Within throwing distance.
You must find this kiln.
That's what we're hoping you're going to do.
We hope so very much. To find the kiln, one's looking for a structure which is tile or brick built with chambers coming into which the fire would be set and the smoke and flame coming out of the top. So it would be a rounded kiln with fire mouths either side or two side by side. So one can find that kiln. Inside it will be complete pots, hopefully stuck together on the last kiln firing. That will be enormously exciting.
Henry couldn't wait to get up to the dig site to see if he could work out the location of the kilns.
Here we are. I got it. And this is the site.
Here we are.
Here we go. My word.
This is what's all been happening.
How long has this taken you?
Well, we've been at it on and off for about 6 years, this site, and this is as far as we've got up to now. But
Yes.
this could have been a workshop. We
The
don't
building
know if
there?
Yes. We found traces of potter's clay at the bottom of the step and then a hearth coming in. Whether this was a hearth for a domestic fireplace or whether it was a commercial one, we don't know. But the suspicions are that it could have been a blacksmith shop at some stage.
It doesn't look like a pottery kiln to me instantly. I would need to have a look at it much more closely, but it looks more like domestic buildings.
That's
But
what we feel.
with all the pottery wasters from here,
They wouldn't have took it very far.
they
you
wouldn't
see.
have. No, they would have been dumped. Probably a great big pile.
Yeah.
You're finding the wasters in a great heap.
That's right, over there in that bank there, you see.
I'd love to see some of that. Can we have
Let's
a look
go and have
over
a look.
there? Somewhere under this ground lies this kiln, and I'd love to find it. I have found kilns in the past. Up in Whitehaven in Cumbria, I walked over the ground and I said to the potters there, the kiln is there, there's a kiln there. And it was. I don't know how I do it. It's the feeling in the fingers, I think, or the blood.
Henry's no stranger to digging for treasure, though he hasn't always been the first on the scene.
Oh, well, there's a piece. Is that?
Yeah.
That's the brown glaze, the brown pots.
Yeah. See, just in those few minutes
Yeah.
it's coming to light.
It's coming to light. All bits found, and then you put them all together, and then...
That's right.
There they are, but slip
Let's look at
decorated.
that piece of dish that we've got already down there, look.
Is that dish? You think you've got part of that
I
already?
think we've got part of that already, you see.
Yes. I wish I'd been in the profession of doing this when I was a kid. It'd be marvellous. Takes me right back to my early days, this does. Pieces, coming up. Yes. Yes, it's
There's
these
a piece
tree
more.
boxes that are... Yes.
The search for the kiln goes on, whatever. However hard we got to look and whatever we got to dig up, the search for the kiln will go on.
In a landscape like this, which looks unchanged, under the ground there lies all the history of our country, and hopefully we're going to find it here. There's a piece there.
Once he got started, there was no stopping our Henry, but we're hoping he will emerge in time for the new series. Finally, my dear Watson, we return to the mystery of the lilac cigarette case. New evidence has shown it was purchased by a Russian diplomat in 1912, which leads us to the question, how did it fall into the hands of its present owner, Kenneth McKinnon?
Is this a gift from somebody? It was a gift to my stepmother from a close family friend about 45 years ago, and she, in her turn, very generously passed it on to me.
We know that this generous gift once belonged to the noted Edwardian hostess of this house, Olive Guthrie. Now it's on its way back to her ancestral home on the Isle of Man. It's about to rejoin her collection of Fabergé.
Can you add a bit of context to all of this?
Well, Mr. McKinnon was given this piece by my great-aunt, and her older sister, my grandmother, would have had these other pieces.
Have you managed to establish a link between Mr. Sevastopoulou and your family in any way at all?
Well, the first thing I did was to look through the visitor's book to see if there was any evidence of him visiting Torosay, but he isn't actually in the book himself. My next port of call, so to speak, was to look in the diaries of a friend of many of the people at that time in their social circle, Colonel Reppington, who was the Times military correspondent during the First World War. And I found that Mr. Sevastopoulou was indeed a friend of Colonel Reppington's, and Colonel Reppington was a friend of the family here.
So it strikes me that actually that's a very strong relationship, and it may be actually endorsed by the fact that I can see Count Benkendorf's signature in the visitors' books here. Count Benkendorf was the ambassador from Nicholas II from Russia to the court of St. James, and a very high-ranking individual in every sense of the word. And it's just possible that he asked his diplomatic colleague to go down to Fabergé in London and buy something essentially Russian to bring here as a gift when he came to stay. Well, it's completely marvellous to see these objects back in their original context, and I can't help but feel, because they have such a resonance one to another, that they might have sat on a table just like this maybe 40 or 50 years ago.
Lovely for me, I think, to have established the origins of these pieces, and my family have had, for 3 generations, I've had an association with the Guthries, and here we are This piece of Fabergé cigarette case, which is now in my family, came from the Guthrie's, and here we are seeing them all united together where they came from in the island of Mull. I had reservations, I must confess, about whether I was coming over to Mull and what for, but it's been a journey, and I think we've achieved something wonderful.
Well, you've gone to enormous trouble today to bring these things from the mainland, from the bank vault, to show us, and whilst they're here, I was wondering if you'd be interested to know some finer details of them.
Please, I'd be absolutely fascinated to hear anything you have to tell us.
Good. Well, this little clock here is a very pretty little boudoir clock, decorated with enamel, and to all intents and purposes it might be by Fabergé. It derives from Louis XVI ornament, but in actual fact it's a French clock, and self-evidently one. It's written on the base there, and it's a perfectly pretty thing in its original box, but probably only worth about £90 today. And then let's look at the Fabergé cigarette case. This is a very noble object indeed, made of rock crystal, a remarkably hard stone. It's nothing to do with glass, sadly not in perfect condition. I think one could repair that and bring it up to perfect state by simply having the top recarved. And I think it would be the right thing to do. It would be a legitimate restoration. In its present condition, £10,000, and fully restored, maybe £30,000. I know.
Sound investment, I suppose.
Well, it is a sound investment. Well, without doubt, the great masterpiece of the collection is this green clock, which is decorated with guilloché enamel. This is an engine-turned armature of silver, engraved with a sunburst, and it's been flooded with translucent enamel, and you're seeing through the enamel onto the engraved ground. I think it's an enormously attractive thing in its own right, but its value has escalated really more than I can tell you over the last 3 or 4 years. And very surprisingly, I have every confidence that this would fetch £250,000.
No, I find that very hard to believe. It's astonishing. I had no idea it was anything like that.
For Chris, I would feel this is something quite hard to handle, because it's obviously a treasured piece and something that he would obviously want to keep in the family. But I can realise, with the maintenance of an estate like this, that sort of value in cash would be manna from heaven.
You ambushed me. You ambushed me.
Absolutely, I knew you'd be a bit cross.
Wow,
Gosh. I had no idea. I shall have to take very good care of them.
Back in the bank vault?
Indeed, yes.
As soon as
Certainly,
possible.
yes.
When we came here today, I knew we were going to see a collection of Fabergé, but I wasn't really prepared for a complete masterpiece from Fabergé. And that was a magical moment, and something I don't think I'll ever forget.
Our very own Goldfinger Geoffrey Munn, the man with the Midas touch. And that's all for now. More discoveries to share next week, including a couple of hidden gems that have ended up in the finest museums in the country. Until then, goodbye.
And that's next Sunday at 6:55 here on BBC One. And then the following...